In this module, we're going to look at ways to deploy your ASP.NET Core applications to Azure App Service. We'll be deploying code and containers. We'll start by creating a sample application to deploy using Visual Studio Community Edition, which is a free download from Microsoft. Then we'll deploy the code to the app service we created in the previous module. First, we'll use the Publish feature of Visual Studio, letting Visual Studio set up all the authentication. Then I'll show you how to download a file from the app service in the Azure portal and import it into Visual Studio so the user can deploy code using that information. Then you'll see how to zip up the Publish files for the ASP.NET Core application and deploy the zip file to app service. You can do it programmatically, but we'll use the Kudu portal to drag the zip file onto the browser and deploy the code. Next, I'll show you a way to mitigate the potential for file locks during deployment by deploying your zip file again, but having Azure App Service mount the zip file as a folder it runs the code from. Next, you'll see how to connect to the FTP endpoint exposed by the app service and use an FTP client tool to upload the code to the app service file share. Then we'll finish the code deployment portion by putting the ASP.NET Core application into a local Git repository. You'll see how to configure App Service to host a remote Git repository that can build and deploy your application source code. And we'll use Git to upload the local code to the remote repository and deploy the application. This can allow you to set up continuous integration, where every time you upload the code, it can get built and deployed. Next, we'll look at deploying containers. First, we'll create a container app in Visual Studio. Then you'll see how to use Visual Studio Publish to push the container to Azure Container Registry, which is a holding place for containers. I'll also show you how to use the Azure Command Line interface to push the source code to Azure and have the Azure Container Registry itself build the container for you. And finally, you'll see how to configure an app service to pull the container from the container registry and host the container. This can be set up for continuous deployment because the app service can be notified when the container gets updated in the registry. The deployment approaches for code that we're going to talk about in this module use 4 basic methods to deploy your app: Web Deploy, Zip Deploy, FTP, and Git. Web Deploy is also known as MS Deploy. It's a framework provided by Microsoft that needs both the source and destination to be Windows-based, with the ability to only copy files that have changed, to set security descriptors on the destination files, and also apply transforms during the deployment. So Web Deploy offers some configuration benefits over the other methods. Zip Deploy is powered by the Kudu extension that's installed in your app service, and it allows you to either push a zip file containing your compiled application, or push a zip file containing the source code and let Kudu build your app before deploying it to the app service. You can publish zip files by using the Kudu web application, which we'll do in this demo, or by using the Azure CLI, PowerShell, or pushing to the Kudu endpoint programmatically using a tool like curl in the bash shell. FTP is the file transfer protocol, and it exposes a port on the web server that allows you to connect and view the remote file system and upload code right to the location where App Service runs the code from. And Git lets you synchronize your local Git repository to a remote repository on the Azure App Service. And Kudu will build and deploy your source code to the App Service for hosting. So let's start by creating an application in Visual Studio that we can deploy to the App Service. Let's create a sample ASP.NET Core application that we can use for deployment. You can do this any way you want, using Visual Studio or using the Azure Command Line interface if you like. I have Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition installed, which is a free download, by the way. So let's create a new project. The ASP.NET Core web app template is here, but if you don't see it, you can search for it at the top. Select it and click Next. And let's give this project a name, something descriptive, and click Next. I'll leave the default framework version, which is the latest at the time of filming, and the other defaults are fine here as well. So let's create this web app. That'll just take a few seconds, and once the project loads, let's make a slight change. I'll open up the home page, which is the index.cshtml page. And let's just change the default text on the page. We'll modify this for different deployments, so you can see that code is getting deployed to the app service. Now let's run the web app in IIS Express. That gets installed with Visual Studio. This will ensure there are no compilation errors. Okay, great. That's all we need for now. Let's close the browser. In the next clip, let's see how to deploy this app to the app service on Azure right from here in Visual Studio. We're going to deploy the web app to Azure right from within Visual Studio. But first, let's navigate to the app service, and I want to turn off authentication. In the previous module, we enabled it so users would have to authenticate to Azure Active Directory. It won't affect deployment by leaving this turned on, but we'll have to authenticate when we want to view the running website. So I'll just delete this identity provider. And I'm being told I need to remove authentication, or we won't be able to reach the site. Okay, now let's go to the Overview tab and browse to the existing web app. There's just the default page that Azure created. Now we're ready to deploy from Visual Studio. Let's go back to Visual Studio, and in Solution Explorer, right-click on the project name. In the menu that pops up, click on Publish. This brings up the Publish dialog, where there are a few options for where and how to publish this web app. We'll use a few of these throughout the module, but the one we want for now is Publish to Azure. On the next screen, there are a few options. We can publish directly to the Windows or Linux app service, so deploy the code. We can deploy to Azure Container Apps, which is a different service in Azure for running containers. We can deploy the code in an Azure Container Registry and run it on the app service. And we can just deploy it to Azure Container Registry and decide later where we want to run it, maybe on Azure Kubernetes Service. Or we can deploy it to an Azure Virtual Machine. We have a Windows app service created already, so let's select this option. On the next screen, there are 3 resource groups showing, and each of these has app services in it. The reason we can see them is because the user account at the top right has defaulted to the administrator account that has full access to the subscription. If I change this to another account in Azure Active Directory, one that doesn't have any permissions on any of the app services, the list disappears. In order to choose an app service from here, a user needs to have at least contributor access on the app service itself. They don't have to be an administrator or have any additional privileges, just have the contributor role assigned, and only scoped to the app service, not even to the app service plan. Let's change back to the admin account. Now let's expand the resource group, and there are 2 app services here, running on the same app service plan. But you don't see the plan information, just the app services. Let's expand the one we created in the previous module. There's a folder for deployment slots. You can choose to deploy directly to a deployment slot, so the production version of the web app isn't affected. But let's choose the root of the app service, and this will deploy the code to the production deployment slot. And now I'll just click Finish. So we haven't deployed the code yet to Azure. All this has done is create a published profile that we can reuse to deploy this code anytime. It shows us the path here, and the file is under the Properties folder. Let's close this dialog, and let's expand the Properties folder in Solution Explorer. There's a folder called Publish Profiles. There's an XML file here that holds the profile information. We'll look more closely at this in the next clip. For now, let's just click Publish from the Publish screen. That'll build the application locally and push the files up to the Azure App Service. But we have an error here. If we look down in the error list, it says we couldn't authenticate to Azure App Service. That's because of a fairly recent change in Azure, whereby the basic authentication protocol used by MS Deploy is not allowed by default. We just need to enable that. So let's go to the Azure portal, to the Configuration tab, and enable SCM Basic Authentication. Notice that FTP authentication is turned off by default also. These are both basic authentication protocols, meaning they require a username and password being passed to Azure. So I'll save these changes, and let's go back to Visual Studio and try to publish again. And after a few seconds, the default browser opens and navigates directly to the deployed web app. There's a bit of a delay before the copied files are actually available though, so I'll just refresh this page. If I go back to the other browser, where we originally browsed to the App Service default page, let's refresh this too. And there's the newly deployed ASP.NET Core application. In the next clip, we're going to look at the Publish profile that was created a little closer, as well as how to deploy from Visual Studio without the user having any permissions in Azure.